Hi, and welcome to our LinkedIn Live broadcast on the release of the ISM Services PMI Report. My name is Dan Zeiger. I'm a senior writer and editor for Inside Supply Management, which is Institute for Supply Management's member publication. And welcome to our discussion as we break down the Services PMI data for February. I'm going to start off with the words of my colleague, who you'll be seeing in a moment, when he wrote in the report, "The services sector is heating up. With all 10 sub-indexes in expansion for the first time since 2021, the services PMI hit 56.1% in February, and that's the highest reading since July of 2022. Demand, especially via backlogs and exports, took a big jump. Employment remained in expansion, and many companies boosted inventories, and there was even a little bit of a cooling on prices, which we'll discuss. But as we did during the manufacturing broadcast on Monday, we're going to spend some time talking about the two seismic supply chain events from the last 12 days, the Supreme Court decision on tariffs, and the strikes on Iran and the aftermath. So as usual, there is a lot to talk about. So let's bring in Steve Miller, the chair of the ISM Services Business Survey Committee. Steve, before we get to current events, you obviously pointed out that the sector is heating up. What stood out in the February data to confirm that assessment?
So I thought you did a great summary there, Dan. You look at new export orders, a significant jump. I think was it 12%, something like that, month over month.
Yeah, 12.2 percentage points.
Yeah, and so when you see new export orders jump like that, you expect to see some influence into new orders, and new orders had a significant jump. Business activity is up. Supplier deliveries are still slow or slower than last month, but a little bit of moderation since last month at 0.3%. And then on the employment, we saw an improvement in employment as well. So across the board, positive signs, huge jump in inventory, and a very small jump in inventory sentiment. Inventory sentiment, when it's up, we're saying that we have too much inventory. And so the only thing I can kind of point to potentially is Lunar New Year. So you bring in product because you're not going to be able to during a certain period of time. And so you have that inventory and you're ready to go. But all across the board, very positive comments, little negativity around tariffs, a couple of comments around the Supreme Court decision coming at the end of the month of February. And so it was all pretty calm and positive, Dan.
Yeah. As you noted before we came on here, our friends at Bloomberg noted that the data moved the market, as you would think that investors would react positively to this kind of data from the services sector, and we'll get to that a little bit more. But it's a sign of what's been going on in the world. It dominated the manufacturing call on Monday with Susan Spence and our time together, and should be talking about that from the top today. And it dominated the phone interview with reporters that you did earlier, just hostilities in Iran and the Middle East. And I'll tell our viewers that Steve Miller and Susan Spence had some great comments in an article that we ran at ISM yesterday. Christina has put the link in the chat. But Steve, for viewers who haven't had a chance to check out that article yesterday, and they should, because it's very thorough and well done by my colleague Sue Dorfler, just what are some of the implications for services companies regarding product availability, prices, travel, other matters of risk?
I thought Susan's comments on Monday's LinkedIn Live were what every supply leader should do, and probably many are already. As you look at your categories and you look at your suppliers, you got to think through one by one, where might you have risk in your supply chain. The old saying, if your feet are in the oven and your head's in the freezer, on average, you're feeling pretty good. But if you have one of those that's in the oven, it's a real problem. So you look at AWS and Amazon, they had an issue in UAE, having a couple of their data centers get hit. And that impacted services in the country, not globally, not in the US. So understanding what those impacts might be and how they can hit you. As you look at our services industries, though, some of them are very at risk for disruptions in trade or travel. So when you think about transportation and warehousing, it was already in contraction last month as a result, probably of Lunar New Year. But now you have trade routes getting squeezed, risk, insurance costs, fuel costs going up. The transportation and warehousing industry is going to be negatively hit. On the information side, it depends whether you're on the cybersecurity buying or selling side. If you're on the selling side, you now have a lot more customers coming and asking you how you can help, because cyber attacks are definitely increasing and going to increase more. From an enterprise who has secure or has sensitive data, and data makes your company run, which is basically every company that isn't a small business in the country. You've got to make sure your cybersecurity provisions are clear and robust. Anything that has to do with hospitality and travel and foreign visitors, old days at Disney, Walt Disney World, we had a huge component of people that were coming from Europe and from the Middle East. This time of year, there may be no travel at all coming from there. I don't know. But when you look at, if you're in the hospitality industry, you'd expect to see some softness in cruise ship bookings, where people traveling, particularly what's going on in Mexico, as well as the Middle East. So a lot of that hospitality related, transportation and warehousing, construction, a lot of construction materials for construction activities overseas are coming from suppliers overseas in that region. And many of our survey respondents are responsible for new orders, those export orders. You're building a utility or you're building a major project over in the Middle East, you're talking about that as being part of your export orders, which I would expect to see some come down in the next report.
Yeah. Well, once again, check out that link that Christina put in the chat. Steve and Susan Spence had some great comments on that article about the potential supply chain impacts from the activities in the Middle East. So please check that out. We'll get to the Supreme Court and tariffs in a minute, but you had mentioned the potential impact on prices. So, let's just get to that. The prices index was 63% in February, and that was actually a decrease of 3.6 percentage points, and it completely opposite of what we saw in the manufacturing sector. And among companies surveyed, 30.7% indicated paying more for materials and services. That was down from 33.4% in January. And I know when we talked last month at this time, you had mentioned that demand and supplier delivery performance could have a potential impact on the prices. But, supplier deliveries, the index, it stayed pretty steady. So there was not much movement there. But just talk about that and how big of a surprise was that it kind of went down a little bit. And is that kind of a risk, based on what could potentially happen, in the aftermath of what's going on in the Middle East?
Sure. So we saw a different thing happen in this month's report, where our backlog of orders had a significant increase as an index. Prior to last month, backlog of orders was pretty flat, and new orders and business activity were very strong. So in that environment, you don't expect to see prices going up. If you have a backlog and you have slow supplier deliveries, then how do I get it? I pay to expedite it, or I pay for expedited transportation. Each case, my input costs are going up. We're not seeing that behavior at all. Now, this last month, where the backlog is increased, good thing to watch in March. If we continue to have that backlog, and if there's continued increase, or if there is an increase in the supplier delivery number, showing that those are starting to get slower. Everything that's going on in the world, you would expect to see that number, that supplier delivery number, going up, because longer transportation routes, because of areas that you can't go through, whether it's flights or whether it's air freight or whether it's ocean freight, we should be seeing an impact in that. Because as the routes get longer, then more capacity is tied up on the ocean. So less capacity is available to take on new loads. It's just, if you drive 100 miles or you drive 50 miles, you have half the capacity. If you're driving 100 miles versus 50, well, if you can't go in certain regions and you have a much longer haul, you expect to see container prices going up, input costs to go up because of that. So I expect to see that behavior come through in the report next month. How big it'll be is very dependent on what type of security primarily U.S. forces can keep in the region over the next month. That also plays right into petroleum, where we saw gasoline and we saw diesel fuel costs going down over the last, I don't know, it was 4 or 5 reports. I don't expect to see that one so prevalent in this next report in March. How high it goes, there's some speculation in Bloomberg today about us just seeing a blip in oil prices, and will that just come back as security is provided? The two big variables are: will there be any events and ocean or oil carriers staying out of the region or having to travel further? The second piece is, will any of the Iranian counterattacks impact any of the production facilities in the area? So far, it doesn't seem like there's been a major impact. It's going to make things more complicated from a logistics standpoint, but from a production standpoint, seems pretty clean. We'll see how that, hopefully, fingers crossed, God willing, that's the way it stays.
Yeah, that's something we'll obviously paying a lot of attention to, and the impact on the data for March. Well, let's get to the recent news event that I thought I would be talking to you about first today, and that was the potential impact of the Supreme Court's ruling on tariffs that were those emergency tariffs that were struck down. I mean, you said in the report that tariffs uncertainty did remain among the service sector respondents, but I mean, there were no alarm bells going off. So just discuss what that ruling and the aftermath could mean for the sector.
Yeah. So, but the best metaphor I can think of is a company I'm familiar with who bought intellectual property back in the early 90s because of a dispute between the original owner and the current owner. There was a lawsuit that was filed around other payments that were due. And that lawsuit in 2010 was still going on. Anytime your decisions rest on law, statutes, disputes, and the Supreme Court, it's not going to be a fast decision. So now there's a whole nother set of changes. There are agreements between countries that may or may not be valid. All of that will be thrown in the mix in terms of ongoing litigation. Don't see any. So two things I think are true. One is we're not going to see any substantial change for some time in impacting prior costs of goods, whether those are paid back, whether something else happens. The new tariffs, of course, will have a new rate, which it looks like from the commentary that our supply chain and supply management professionals get it. They've seen the back and forth and the up and down. They know that that's something that their CFO is going to be calling them on as soon as there's a new ruling. And so they've built that muscle to be able to respond. It doesn't seem, we're not getting in the services sector a whole bunch of commentary around uncertainty. There's a little bit, but uncertainty around how the Supreme Court was going to rule, but not a lot of uncertainty around, we don't know how this is going to impact our supply chains and what it'll do to our cost of goods. Those who had to take the tariffs are saying it's now embedded in our supply chain, and those that were able to negotiate it away are just not talking about it at all. The other side of it is that there's a small piece of our cost of sales, cost of operations within the services sector that are based on imports. You can see that by the percentage of companies that don't even measure or use imports that we have in the report every month. I believe it's 40%. Now, if you're in the construction industry and you depend on imported steel or aluminum, big deal. but for a lot of other sectors and even companies in those industries that don't depend on that imported product, it's a non-event. So it's a small percentage of cost, except for in some very isolated situations in the services industry. That the back and forth certainly drives level of effort to understand what the impact is and then make supply decisions. But it seems like we're pretty good at it now.
Yeah. Yeah, despite that uncertainty that you pointed out, I mean, buyers were not skittish in February, as the data showed. If my math was correct, that's a combined gain of 32.1 percentage points for the big demand indicators. Business activity index, which was 59.9%, new orders 58.6, backlog, as you mentioned earlier, 55.9, and new export orders 57.2. And the latter, as you pointed out earlier, did take the biggest leap of those four indexes. It was up 12.2 points. Yeah, just what got into buyers in February?
Maybe the weakness of the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the need to accelerate imports to avoid impacts from Lunar New Year on the import side, and back to the value of the dollar. If the value of the dollar is declining, it means it's cheaper to buy our goods, and that may be driving exports to some degree. I don't understand how big that jump was month over month, because it isn't like the dollar weakened significantly. It may just be a combination of a weaker dollar, tariff regulations finally being agreed between countries to some degree, for at least large trading partners, Canada, Mexico, for anything that was still outstanding. And then, the last piece being the new year, new contracts, new agreements where people have decided who's going to bear the cost of tariffs. Incoterms can be a wonderful thing, and if you make the tariff impact somebody else's problem, at least you don't have to do the administration on your side. You may be a loser at the end because you were expecting it to be high and you agreed, and that ended up being low, but at least it doesn't have to be part of your administrative work.
Yeah. Well, and also demand was significantly promising in February. I also thought investment stood out. I mean, if you go by the employment and the inventories index, I mean, companies looked like they were invested in filling staffs. I mean, the employment index was 51.8%. That's a third straight month of expansion. We got the ADP number today. That was 63,000, generally considered good, especially compared to the revised number of 11,000 for January. And then, of course, we get the big federal report on Monday. And then they also invested in filling their shelves. The inventory index was 56.4%. That was up 11.3 percentage points compared to January. It was just 1 month in contraction for that index. One of the panelists wrote that their company was starting to build up in preparation for the activity for the next 3 quarters. So that kind of exemplifies confidence.
Yes.
How encouraging were those data points?
Oh, very, very encouraging, Dan.
Mm-hmm.
When you look at some of the numbers that we had, it was just trying to do some trend analysis. 8 of the 10 indexes over the last 6 months have been on a positive trend. Mm-hmm. That isn't hey, we got 1 month blip, wonder what's going to happen next. It's 8 of the 10 are on a positive trajectory over the last 6 months. 2 that are not. One is prices. Mm-hmm. Also, more good news that it's trending downward overall over the last 6 months. The other one was inventory sentiment. Okay, so we're getting our inventory in place. Maybe some of the things that rattled us around tariffs are out of the way now, and we know what we need. We're getting the right stuff because people bought a lot of stuff once the tariffs were starting to be discussed and wanted to get ahead of that tariff impact. You can only guess so well. That's the beauty of demand planning, and then flowing that back to what actual units are going to be ordered, and a tremendous effort in the manufacturing space, but it also impacts the services space as well, where if you're building and you have a plan that you're going to build to for housing, and then maybe things don't come through exactly the way you wanted, but you bought steel ahead, you bought lumber ahead to avoid the tariffs, you bought aluminum ahead, and now you don't need it in the same mix of finished products as you thought you were going to need before. Seems like all that has been working its way out. And overall, it feels really good, Dan. It feels like we've got a 6-month trend that's working in our favor. The one thing I know we've heard a lot about outside of ISM, but also is relevant for prices paid for services, is we're still at 60. We're still above 60.
Mm-hmm.
So when we saw the huge inflationary spikes, we were at the high 70s, low 80s. So we're nowhere near that. But because the number comes down doesn't mean things are getting cheaper, obviously. It's like inflation.
Mm-hmm.
You have inflation, costs continue to go up. They may go up slower than they did during, and certainly in some areas are, but for those who are buying memory and chips, boy, that's not going down. That's going up really fast.
Yeah.
So when you're in an area where there's a lot of competition, and one of the areas where we're seeing consistent, strong commentary is around AI, data centers, and power for those that are all in the services sector.
Yeah. Well, I know we like to focus on an industry, a particular industry from time to time, and one that stood out to me in February was transportation and warehousing. It appeared to have had a challenging month. It was just one of just 3 industries in contraction for the month. And then was this panelist quote that stood out. He said, he or she wrote that transportation and truck capacity has been extremely tight, causing rates to spike 30% to 40%. Some of this can be attributed to the weather. Some can be attributed to federal regulations or a federal push to make sure all drivers are proficient in English. And others can be attributed to an increase in commerce. Just can you break down the industry's performance in February? And what were some of the troubles?
Yeah, so transportation and warehousing was one of the 2 or one of the 3 sectors in contraction. For last month, we had arts, entertainment, and recreation, retail, trade, and transportation and warehousing. Mm-hmm. End of year, you get past the lead up to the holidays. We saw negative, or we saw some contraction in November. We saw growth in December, and then we saw contraction in January and February. If you look back to prior year, we didn't have that behavior at all last year. It was green all the way. So that, I think that does give you some pause, Dan, because for any goods that we use, they got to move. We do have a really good mix of companies that are in that transportation and warehousing sector. Some of them are impacted by weakness in food services. Food services have been good. Some of them would be impacted on mining. Mining's been good. Some of them are impacted by construction. Construction has been good the last two months. So it looks like there's, the comments that you made, very relevant. It looks like that's impacting, those very likely are impacting performance and the ability to grow business.
Yeah.
And then I'll expect in March, the pressure is even going to be more because of the turmoil.
Yeah. And I know last month at this time, I had asked you what kind of an impact do you expect the winter storms to play in the March data? Obviously, overall for the services sector, I mean, it was, wasn't that big of a factor, but yeah, I would think transportation and warehousing would be one of those that would be especially hard. Yeah.
And Christina helped us out with airlines being in the transportation and warehousing piece, I believe. And so not a surprise then. When you saw what was happening in Mexico and people not traveling to Mexico, and at least in certain regions of Mexico, that's going to impact transportation and warehousing as well.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned with Susan Spence on Monday, and I want to remind our viewers that Steve and Susan, once again, she's the chair of the Manufacturing Business Survey Committee. They will host a session at ISM World 2026 on how the ISM PMI reports can help a company's business decisions in areas like forecasting, planning, risk management, and more. That conference is April 26th through the 28th in Denver, and you can get more information at ismworld.org/conference. If you like the conversations that I have with Steve and Susan each month, and especially when I get to talk to them together when we talk about the supply chain planning forecast, you'll enjoy it when they're up on the stage in person. But so in the spirit of that, as I talked to Susan on Monday, if I'm a CEO or a data or a C-suite executive, what should I take away? What should I know about this month's data?
So I work at an insurance distributor, and the value of having insurance is that risk can be shared across individuals or across companies. We're going to see a spike in insurance costs, risk premium related to things going on in the Middle East for anybody that's exposed to that. But for long-term suppliers, they may be looking at risks or seeing risks that you don't have. If you're able to work as a supply chain network with those that have and don't have risks across your network, you can create a great bond and shared accountability for what might happen and how to adjust for it. So my advice to CEOs would be identify those senior leaders that are in your supply base that are significant, and have conversation with them around what risks are they seeing, what do they need to, what do those CEOs need to be preparing for, and are there ways that they can work together to mitigate the risk for both of them or all of them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, yeah, an informative, session as usual, and there was certainly a lot to talk about. And yeah, those are all the questions that I have, Steve. I mean, is there anything that we haven't talked about or anything that I haven't asked that you think might be important to add before we wrap it up?
This was a fun session, Dan. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Steve, for joining us. And yeah, thank you for joining us today. In a bit, you can go to ISM's website and read the roundup article that details a lot of what Steve and I have discussed here. And if you want to be a part of the ISM Manufacturing or Services Business Survey panels that help compile data for the ISM PMI reports, visit ismworld.org/join the panel for more information. Hey, we'll see you back here in a month. I'm sure we will have a lot to talk about when we break down the ISM PMI reports data for March. So for Steve Miller, and some people who helped us behind the scenes today, they are Christina Cahill and Jennifer Stevens. My name is Dan Zeiger. We'll see you next time.